3 lives, 3 worlds. Lotus steps, wherever step goes, lotus blooms. Metamorphosis. Chapter 10, Book 1. There was a banquet that night, but Qingyu didn't show up. The emperor came to Tsushui Garden to spend the summer and have fun, so he would have banquets with ministers from time to time. There were always juggling, singing, and dancing at the banquets. The emperor knew that Qingyu loved this, but she was not seen at the banquet. The emperor laughed angrily and said to Eunuch Shin, "She actually knows how to hide from me." Eunuch Shin was humble on behalf of Qingyu. The little princess is also a shameful person. The next day, the Empress Dowager summoned the princess and her ministers to listen to the play. After the emperor and his ministers had finished discussing the matter, the Empress Dowager sent someone to invite him. The emperor took several of his close ministers with him and met Prince Lichuan on the way. The emperor also invited the prince along the way. When he arrived at the theater, he took a brief look at the stands, but he still didn't see Qingyu. The emperor was confused and said to Eunuch Shin, "It doesn't look like you are hiding from me. You don't even come to listen to the play. What a shame. Have you changed your gender?" Eunuch Shin is a meticulous person and never talks nonsense about things that he is not sure about, so he very cautiously replied to the emperor, "How about I go and inquire about it?" The emperor brought him here to listen to the play. In addition to Prince Lichuan, there were also several important officials who had just discussed matters in the council hall, including the general, the left and right ministers of the East and West Taiwan, the minister of the Ministry of Personnel, the Ministry of Rights and the Ministry of Work, and the imperial advisor. I am an emperor who has a very clean back house, and his family affairs are also very clean. In addition to marrying a princess, I still marry a princess, so I never avoid foreign ministers when discussing family affairs. However, the foreign ministers did not give much advice on the emperor's family affairs. When Cheng Yun discussed family affairs, only Eunuch Shin could always accompany him. But today the general actually interjected, "Is she sick?" Everyone in the court knew that the general was the cousin of the 19th Princess Yanlan. When the general, who had always been a nosy person, asked this question at this time, he thought that the emperor just mentioned was Princess Yanlan. The emperor obviously thought so, because he said to Lian San, "My dear, there is no need to worry about it. Yanlan has nothing to do with her." The general raised his eyes, seemingly confused. "Isn't what the emperor mentioned just now Ruby?" Prince Lichuan, who had been silent all the time, looked obviously startled and looked straight at Lian San. The emperor, who was asked bluntly by Lian San, was stunned and said, "I just asked you that it is indeed Ruby," he said curiously, "but how do you know?" The general said calmly, "I can only make a guess." He muttered, "The princess loves banquets and listening to plays." At last night's banquet and even in the theater today, she was nowhere to be seen. The general lowered his eyes slightly. "I still love to listen to plays. I think she is sick." Prince Lichuan looked at Lian San and frowned slightly. The emperor also frowned slightly, but they didn't seem to be frowning over the same thing. The emperor said, "She was riding a horse in the court yesterday afternoon. Ben, I didn't see any signs of illness, so it stands to reason." The general had already stood up from the rosewood chair. "On behalf of the emperor, I'd go to see the princess." Prince Lichuan also seemed to want to get up, but he stopped again with his hands on the armrests of the chair. After all, the prince is still the prince who takes the overall situation into consideration and knows what to do and what not to do in such situations. The ministers present did not realize this little move of the Prince Wang. The ministers stared dumbfoundedly at the emperor who was sitting in deep thought and the general whose back was fading away. They felt that the conversation between the emperor and the general was very magical. They had the impression that the general talked little and had almost nothing to talk to the emperor during discussions. Of course, he had nothing to talk to them. They never expected that one day they would hear the general talking to the emperor about women in front of them, and the person he was talking about was Hongyu. Princess Hongyu had some relationship with the general. Although the Empress Dowager strictly ordered the palace not to mention it again, but in order to refuse the marriage, the general even changed the name of the family before the Northern Wei dynasty was destroyed. Coming out. The important officials suppressed the turmoil in their hearts and looked at each other. The ministers were gossiping and confused, and the emperor was actually a little confused. But how could the emperor reveal his doubts to others easily? So after all the ministers had dispersed, he asked Eunuchshin, "What happened to Lian San Tong Hong Jade?" Eunuchshin is a person who speaks very interestingly. Eunuchshin smiled and replied, "Does your majesty hope that the general and the princess will have something to do, or do they have nothing to do?" The emperor took a sip of tea and said, "If Lian San doesn't want to marry, that's okay. If he wants to marry, for the sake of starting a family, he'd better marry my eldest daughter." For the first time in Cheng Yun's life, he felt that the topic of marrying a girl was not something he wanted to do. It was so heavy, but when I thought about what kind of virtue this cousin actually was, I couldn't help but feel depressed. Hong Yu is also 16, and she knows how to mess around every day. She rides a horse and climbs trees, and she even roasts birds. Mentioning this, Cheng Yun's heart ached again, and he calmed down for a long time. Only that face can still be seen. At this time, I hope that Lian San can be as superficial as possible and break his oath to give her to Hong Yu for that face. Married. Eunuchshin was a little worried, but as far as I know, the general is not a superficial person. Cheng Yun is about to suffer from angina pectoris. Eunuchshin came closer and whispered, "Old slave, I heard that the little princess performed the 5 sticks flying 5 copper coins stunt while playing in the court yesterday, which attracted all the players in Wu Nuosu to worship. The little princess was really looking forward to it at that time. She was very handsome and full of energy. The general saw it on the viewing platform and seemed to admire it very much." The old slave guessed that this was the case, and that is why the general paid attention to the little princess today. Because Cheng Yun was not good at playing bows, he didn't understand the concept of 5 sticks flying 5 copper coins, so he didn't understand how much limelight Cheng Yu had made yesterday. Hearing Eunuchshin talk about Gu Pan Shengzi's words, he became even more excited. Wu Wang said, "Gu Pan is so handsome and full of energy. To put it bluntly, it's still the same face." He asked Eunuchshin, if Lian San saw Hong Yu climbing over a wall, climbing a tree, and roasting a bird, would he still be fascinated by Hong Yu? Although Eunuchshin was a father-in-law, he couldn't imagine what kind of man could be obsessed with such a girl, so Eunuchshin chose to remain silent. Cheng Yun was silent for a while, and then asked, "What are the confidant Lian San usually like?" In this regard, Eunuchshin had the same Pepsi-style as when the imperial advisor served the late emperor, and he immediately responded eloquently. "The general seems to prefer quiet girls, who speak softly, walk like weak willows and help the wind, and also have high talents. He can paint pictures with bare hands, and he can also play the yaoqin, as are several of the general's confidants." The emperor heard the word digit and sighed. "If Hong Yu can marry 3 times in a row, I don't know whether I will be good or bad to her." Eunuchshin said, "Your Majesty has a kind heart." But the emperor only drank half a cup of tea. Before he finished the tea, he decided to sell the jade. He raised his head and said to Eunuchshin, "Lian San loves piano and painting. The painter and piano player in the palace picked to go give Hong Yu some extra lessons. Fortunately, she is smart and can learn anything quickly." Eunuchshin understood and said with a smile how to talk and walk. The old slave also asked the palace servant to help Princess Kwang. "Cheng Yu is indeed ill. Panic syndrome. It's an old disease. Made it last night. Ziyut and in Sherwa Tower will wake up from her slumber in the next few days, and Zhu Hibiscus must be in charge." The awakening of the leader of Yudanhua is a big deal, so Cheng Yu asked Li Xiang to stay. Cheng Yu entered the palace alone, and the Queen Mother allocated a few palace attendants for her temporary use. Because she never liked people following her, and the palace attendant in front of the Queen Mother was not as skilled as Li Xiang, she lost her on the way to the banquet last night. In the end, it was Miss Qi who carried Cheng Yu back, who had fainted and was unaware of his identity. Fortunately, Li Xiang came back in time from the affairs at Shawalu, so this incident did not alarm the Empress Dowager, and the Emperor. Li Xiang hurried back to the city through the darkness and went to Renan Hall to pick up Li Muzhou, who had just undressed and gone to bed. Dr. Li was able to diagnose and treat Chengyu with his eyes closed. He was carried by Li Xiang and gave Chengyu a few injections. He yawned and kneaded a few fragrant balls for her to light in the incense burner. He then retired with great success. Li Xiang carried it and sent it back again. Chengyu, who was in a coma, didn't know that she was sick or that she was in a coma. When she fell asleep in a coma, she didn't know that she was dreaming. Because it's all very real. In the dream, she had just broken up with Miss Chi at the wedding venue. She successfully challenged the 5 sticks flying 5 coppers challenge today. She did it once by herself, and Miss Lucy, the Queen Mother's niece who served as a defender on Dashi's team, asked her to do it again. She performed brilliantly both times. But doing this takes energy, so she gets sleepy as soon as it gets dark. But Miss Chi said that there are 2 lions in the acrobatic troupe kept in the palace that can celebrate birthdays and will entertain them at tonight's banquet. She could not miss this kind of novelty, so she suppressed her sleepiness and made an appointment with Miss Chi to meet by the rockery in Jianshuiyuan half an hour later, and they would go to a banquet to see the lions together. She dozed off and went back to Songhe courtyard to change clothes, but she didn't expect that as soon as she walked around the veranda behind Mingwei Hall, she saw Ji Mingfeng standing under a locust tree. At that time, dusk swallowed up the last ray of glow on the horizon, and the palace lanterns were lit, reflecting the long veranda. She stood at the corner and looked over. Half of the body of Prince Ji, dressed in black, was hidden in the shadow of twilight, and the other half of his body was in the bright light of the palace lantern. The fragrance of locust flowers wafts in the wind. She knew what locust flowers looked like. Someone had once drawn them to her. They looked like little bells strung together in a cluster. Children in Lichuan all like to tie small bells like this on their wrists and ankles. Ding-dang, ding-dong, when the bell rings, it is often accompanied by the laughter of the children. Dragonfly once gave her a set of small bells made of silver. They were tied around her wrists and made a tinkling sound when she moved them. Dragonfly's eyebrows curved. The princess really likes this. The evening breeze blew by and she blinked. In the blink of an eye, she seemed to hear the ringing of the bell again. She held her wrist, but there was nothing on it. Nan Rand Ancient Tomb. The bell is gone, and so is the dragonfly. The sleepiness dissipated in an instant, and she stood there with a pale face in a daze for a while. It was not until a group of palace maids carrying lanterns gently walked past Ji Mingfeng that they stopped to salute him, breaking the stillness of the scene and driving away those helpless people. The endless ringing of bells brought her back to the present world. When she came back to her senses, she felt that Ji Mingfeng might not have seen her, so she took 2 steps back to a laurel tree at the corner, intending to take a detour to avoid him. But I heard the young man's voice suddenly ring out, "Are you hiding from me?" She froze. Ji Mingfeng slowly came to her. The group of maids in plain clothes holding lanterns also happened to be walking beside her. The maids stopped, bowed to her, and then filed away. The swaying lights were like morning stars breaking in the sea. She froze for a moment. "I'm not hiding from you." Ji Mingfeng just looked at her. After all, she was not good at lying, so she chose to remain silent under Ji Mingfeng's gaze. Of course, she was avoiding him. At that time, when Zhu Jin took her away from Lichuan Palace, she thought of Ji Mingfeng for a moment. In that brief moment, she only thought of the last words Ji Mingfeng left for her. "You are so bold and wanton, and you are wrong. I have not repented 100 times. Today, a dragonfly died because of you, and in the future more men from Lichuan will die because of your willfulness. Can you afford so many lives?" She was still worried that these words would sting her. "As if it didn't hurt enough," he said, "maybe because you are the princess, you think they are born with low lives. You don't actually care about so many lives." Therefore, she felt that it was impossible for Ji Mingfeng to want to see her. No matter how unreasonable she is, she still knows this. She thought that for the sake of each other, it would be best for the 2 of them to become strangers, but today he made her a little confused. Ji Mingfeng seemed to be here just for her? What's there to say about meeting again, reminding her again and again that she still carries a human life with her? She leaned against the wooden railing and looked at Ji Mingfeng blankly, thinking, yes, maybe that's what he thought. She didn't speak for a long time, and Ji Mingfeng was quiet for a while. Finally, it was Ji Mingfeng who broke the silence and asked her softly, just now I saw you and your friends playing bao at the court. You played very well. I didn't see how much you enjoyed this activity when I was in Lichuan. Ji Mingchun invites you. You never pay attention to him. Ji Mingchun is Ji Mingfeng's brother, a swinger born from a side wife, idle all day long and a good cockfighting lackey. He said slowly, at that time you only loved reading. In less than 2 months, you went back and forth through the books in my study twice. There was a trace of sadness and nostalgia in his voice. Now, it's much more lively than it was back then. Qingyu didn't speak. She lowered her head and looked at the shadows of the trees on the corridor. Ji Mingfeng also followed her gaze to look at the gently swaying tree shadows. After a while, he sighed, long time no see, Ayu. Don't you have anything to say to me? She still didn't speak. Ji Mingfeng paused for a moment and frowned slightly, although you were quiet back then. She finally spoke. She interrupted him and repeated his words, at that time. She whispered, the Crown Prince always wants me to remember that time. It's because the Crown Prince feels that I am not qualified to live happily. Ji Mingfeng was stunned there. There was a breeze, and she thought she heard the gentle ringing of bells again. She tried several times and finally said the name. I haven't forgotten Dragonfly, she said. She did not look at Ji Mingfeng, but looked far into the winding corridor. At that time, the prince said that my willfulness would kill many people. She paused, although it didn't come true in the end. I have never forgotten it. I did kill the dragonfly. Her eyes were wide open, and her frown made her look like she was about to cry, but her voice was steady. The prince said that I am the princess, so he doesn't care. The crown prince may not believe in human life, but I actually... She blinked, with a little redness at the end of her eyes. I actually... Don't talk about so many lives. I can't afford even one life. She tightened her grip. She bit her lip and didn't cry out after all. The wind suddenly picked up. It was going to be a cool night, and the small osmanthus leaves were blown rustling. Ji Mingfeng's eyes were very deep, and he took a step forward. Those words I said. She took a step back and said, I really hope to be strangers to the Crown Prince, but I also know that the Crown Prince thinks I don't deserve this hope. The Crown Prince asked me if there is nothing I want to say to you. There was a hint of confusion on her face. Confused, I never thought I would meet the Crown Prince again in this life, so I don't know what to say. She paused, as if she was a little confused. The Crown Prince sees me once, and he tortures me once. The prince may think that I deserve to be tortured like this, but... She moved her gaze to Ji Mingfeng, but she didn't see anything. She only felt the ringing in her head getting louder, and a pinprick-like pain came from the deepest part. She whispered, Please, Your Majesty, have mercy on me. Ji Mingfeng's face turned pale in an instant. She didn't see it, because her eyes were blurry. Ji Mingfeng was just a black shadow in her eyes. Her eyes began to sting, and she rubbed them randomly with her hands. At that moment, she noticed that Ji Mingfeng seemed to want to come forward. She was not sure what he wanted to do, so she instinctively avoided it. She said goodbye in a hurry, but she didn't see Ji Mingfeng's expression when she said goodbye. Ji Mingfeng didn't try to stop her, and he didn't catch up with her when she left quickly. Then she returned to Songhiyuan in a daze, took 2 Ningxin pills, and was in a daze for a while, remembering her appointment with Miss Qi. She took a little palace made out and went out. She even forgot to change her clothes. The sweaty white skirt was wrapped around her body. When the night breeze blew in the cool night, she started to sneeze halfway. The little palace maid went back to help her get the cloak, and she stood in a sheltered place to wait. When she was bored, she looked up and saw many lights floating not far away. She remembered that it was a lake and wondered who was putting the river lanterns. Idle and idle, she walked over. There were many stone lamp holders standing by the lake. When passing the 7-stone lamp holder, she vaguely saw the girls setting the river lanterns. They seemed to be several noble ladies who had been invited to the palace to spend the summer. The lake breeze blew by, and suddenly there was an argument among the ladies. The sound was a little vague, but urgent and sharp. She had no interest in this kind of thing, and turned around to go back along the original path, but suddenly she heard a scream. "Help! Our young lady fell into the water." She turned back instinctively. The moment she looked back, she saw the struggling figure on the lake, and the broken water splashed up by her panicked arms. The water splash is white. The picture was not clear, but it was like a heavy hammer hitting her brain. Her vision went dark, and the white arms waving frantically on the lake because they didn't know how to swim seemed to suddenly come to her eyes. Tear. The seal is released. In the terrifying darkness, she saw Nan Ran's ancient tomb again. It was as if I had once again returned to the tomb path filled with poisonous weeds. Dragonfly held her hand and ran along the path. From the depths of the ancient tomb came the soft sound of drums, boom, boom, boom. The sound of the drums summoned countless poisonous insects to follow closely behind them. In front of them is the Pond of Bones. There is a wooden rope bridge over the pond. As long as they cross the bridge and cut off the bridge ropes to block the poisonous insects, they will be saved. She pressed her chest, just a fragment of the memory making her breathless. She reached out and grabbed the laurel tree beside her. Can't think of it. She warned herself tremblingly, but the memory that was torn apart was like an evil tiger that had not eaten for a long time. Once the target was confirmed and ready to attack, it pounced with a ferocity that wanted to devour her. She fell down beside the laurel tree. In the endless silence, she heard the dragonfly's voice behind her, "Princess, run." She turned around suddenly and saw herself, who was less than 16 years old, falling beside the broken rope bridge and in front of her. The bone-transforming pool splashed with water 10 feet high. The water splash is white. She heard herself scream, "Dragonfly." She couldn't stand up, and despair climbed all the way up her spine, through her shoulders and neck, like a dense silk net that was about to crush her brain. She crawled toward the bone pool while crying the dragonfly's name. At that cold and frightening moment, a hand reached out and covered the back of her hand. That hand was very warm. She opened her eyes. There was a faint light entering his eyes, a dim yellow light, like the ever-burning mermaid lantern in Nan Ran's ancient tomb. But this was not the ancient tomb of Nan Ran, because she saw the bed tent above her head. There were embroidery of stars on the tent roof, and Qingyu realized in a daze that she was in her own room in Chunshan Courtyard, lying on her own bed, and that she was dreaming just now. She opened her eyes wide and recalled the dream she had just had. Everything in the dream was true. She did meet Ji Mingfeng, she did catch a cold, and she did see a girl setting a river lantern by the lake falling into the water. Then she, unable to bear the fear at that moment, he fainted next to a laurel tree. Once the memories were opened, it was difficult to seal them again. The terrible memories of the moment she fainted came into her mind again. Those memories were all true, except for one, when she was crawling like crazy in the dark tomb. When she went to the bone pool, at that desperate moment, no one reached out to her. Only that is false. She sat up slowly and looked at the bed blankly. There was the sound of footsteps, and a man's figure suddenly appeared on the 6 screens. Since there was no other man besides Zhu Hibiscus who would appear in her room late at night, she thought nothing of it. Zhu Jin must have held a candle, and the room was brighter than before. She lowered her head and rubbed her eyes. While she was rubbing her eyes, he walked around the screen and came to her bed. The lamp was placed on the small flower table next to the bed. She sat there languidly, hugging her knees, not raising her head or speaking, a gesture of rejection. But Zhu Jin did not retreat despite the difficulty. Instead, he sat next to her on the bed. The next moment, a soaked white silk handkerchief was pressed against her face. She lowered her head and avoided it. "I didn't mean to recall it, I just saw it." She paused, the seal was triggered and it untied itself. The hand holding the silk handkerchief echoed in her voice. He took it back, paused, and then folded the silk handkerchief twice. Zhu Jin did not have such elegant habits, but she did not think of this at this time. She forced herself to breathe calmly and continued, "You sealed those things. This year, I will never think of them actively again, so I can live a carefree life for a long time, but maybe I am not worthy of this carefree life." Concerned. She choked, stretched out her right hand to cover her eyes. "I miss Dragonfly very much, just for one night." She paused for a while. "I don't want to be sealed, and I don't want anyone to stay by my side, just for one night." The folded silk handkerchiefs were placed on the small flower table holding the lamp, in a small square stack. A lantern suddenly burst out from the lamp socket of the oil lamp with a snap. Zhu Jin did not answer her. That hand gently opened the small drawer of small items on the bedside and took out a pair of silver scissors. The oil lamp was caged, the wick was cut, and the flame brightened instantly. Only then did Chang Yu hear the other party say, "Zhu Jin, what did he seal?" It was a cold voice that was familiar, but should never appear here at this time. Chang Yu suddenly raised her head. The young man sitting beside her bed was putting down the scissors and wiping his hands with the silk handkerchief he had just prepared to wipe her tears. When he felt her gaze, he raised his head and glanced at her. The next moment, he stretched out his hand and touched her eyes with his thumb, as if he expected that she would avoid it. His other free hand held her shoulder and pulled her lightly, with a gentle force. But she leaned over uncontrollably. He only had time to raise his hand and put it on his chest. She looked up at him confusedly. He seemed oblivious to the palm that was pressed against his chest to show rejection. The right hand that was touching her eyes came gently to her eyes, and then his thumb wiped away her eyes little by little. Tears under eyes. Realizing that the young man was wiping her tears, Chang Yu immediately wanted to do it by herself, but her raised hand was stopped by the young man. "Let me do it," he said. His thumbs stroked her eyes back and forth, and his lips pursed slightly, which made his expression look a little too serious. Chang Yu's face turned pale little by little, because in the silence of that moment, she remembered what she had said in tears in front of the young man. She talked about the hibiscus seal. That's the secret. Her whole body trembled nervously. "Brother Lian-san, I'm not." His fingers were still at the end of her eyes, wiping away the last trace of tears. He whispered, "You don't want to tell me what Jew hibiscus sealed in your consciousness, do you?" She froze for a moment and immediately retorted, "It's not what you think. The seal I just mentioned, it is actually. It's a kind of magic." He caught her words and looked at her moist eyes. "Everyone in the clan knows that Princess Hong Yu is ill and lives on the flowers in Shihua Tower. They also know that they serve Princess Hong too. The grown-up attendant is an extraordinary person found by King Jing'an." He said calmly, "It is not unusual for an extraordinary person to know magic." Chang Yu froze again. She lowered her head, and her face finally left Lian-san's fingers. He didn't hold back and let go of her. After a long time, she raised her head again and whispered, "Brother Lian-san, when did you know that I am Hong Yu?" "Yesterday." She was quiet for a moment, hugging her knees and explaining, "I didn't lie to you. I just didn't tell you, but you didn't ask either." Suddenly she remembered that Lian-san seemed to have asked her which AU she was from, and immediately he changed his mind and said, "You didn't press hard enough to ask." He smiled and said, "I didn't tell you who I was. We are even." She shook her head. "I actually know you are a general." She did know that Lian-san was a general, but she had never bothered to think about what kind of general he was. It seemed unnecessary. Thinking about it carefully at this time, the Dashi dynasty had a total of 17 guards to command millions of troops in the world. 4 of them guarded Ping'an City all year round. In addition, the emperor also had personal guards who were divided into 3 armies: Tianwu, Yuanwu, and Weiwu. The troops also stay in the capital all year round. Since she often met Lian-san on the street, this meant that Lian-san was probably an internal general serving among the 3 armies and 4 guards. Unexpectedly, Lian-san sighed, "You don't know who I am. But it doesn't matter who you are. It's enough that I know you are a general, she said firmly. He seemed stunned and paused for a while before asking, so, it doesn't matter if you are a general? Most of the 3 armies and 4 guards in Pingan City were selected from the Lord's children, and the Lian family was one of the 5 surnames of Daxi's famous family. In the Daxi dynasty, all armies and guards had the posts of generals and generals. It is not surprising that one of the 7 generals was from the Lian family. She was surprised for a moment. Is he a general? The 7 generals of the 3 armies and 4 guards were all ranked in the 3rd rank. Lian San was so young, but he was already a 3rd-rank general. Her surprise at this time was all out of admiration, but at the same time, she was a little confused. What does it matter if he is a general? Lian Song looked at her for a while. Do you think I am the general of the 3 armies and 4 guards? Chang Yu was a little confused. Then, except for the 3 armies and 4 guards, are you the general of the other 13 guards? She thought for a while, then shook her head. Don't lie to me. The generals of the other 13 guards are now. I don't think the chance of accompanying the emperor's cousin to the palace is very high. Are there other generals on the 17th guards? Lian Song asked her. There are indeed other generals above the 3rd-grade generals of the 17th guards, and there is more than one. Qin Yu was a princess who often helped the disciples inside and outside the imperial city write their homework to earn pocket money. Of course, she knew Daxi's military system better than the other princesses. Among the various generals of the 3rd rank, there is also a 2nd-rank general who governs the country, a 2nd-rank general who assists the country, and a 1st-rank general who holds a fish talisman and commands millions of troops. That's right, the highest rank of their Daxi dynasty generals is actually not as gorgeous as the ranks below it. There is no attributive in front of it, just 3 words, general. General. Qing Yu let out a sigh, and suddenly remembered that the imperial treasure that was sure to win the northern guards in 7 battles when he was a young soldier in the army was named Lian. Chang Yu stared blankly at the young man sitting on the edge of the bed. You are the general. His Highness the Third nodded. Yes. That general was the only company general in the empire, and he was the company general who broke off her marriage. Seeing Chang Yu standing there in shock, His Highness was silent for a moment. You have nothing to say to me? Yes, yes. She swallowed her saliva and asked him tentatively, in the past few days, Wu Nuosu's envoys have come to court. Do you think they saw you looking like this? Did they do anything for our Daxi court? Are you worried about the future? His Highness the Third Prince smiled. Seeing that I am so healthy, they may be more worried about Wu Nuosu's future. Oh! Chang Yu said dryly, then I'll be relieved. His Highness looked at her calmly. Besides, I think you have something else to say to me. I didn't, she replied. You have. I didn't. Well, I did. Chang Yu's eyes wandered. I know what you want me to say, Brother Lian San. She paused. You want to know that when you cancelled my engagement, have I ever blamed you? Now that I know you are the one who broke off my engagement, have I ever blamed you again, right? As if knowing that he would not answer, she hugged her knees and looked at him sideways. I never cared about this matter. Even if I didn't know that you broke off my engagement at that time, I didn't get pregnant. I won't be angry with you, let alone now. She pursed her lips as if she was amused, but now I think about it, the person who was almost forced by the imperial grandmother to marry me was actually the person who even married me. Third brother, you're a bit funny. She rested her face on her knees and couldn't help but laugh. What would happen if Brother Lian San and I got married? It must be weird, because Brother Lian San is the older brother. She felt interesting to herself, but she heard him suddenly speak with a cold voice. I'm not your brother. He sat beside her bed with his back to the candlelight, his face expressionless. She was stunned for a moment, but he didn't let her retort come out. You heard me clearly, he looked at her, his whole body a little inhumane and cold. I am not your brother. She blinked and realized that he was angry, but she didn't know what made him angry. But you said it yourself, you are my brother. He suddenly smiled, but the smile was also cold. What do I say? She was at a loss and held it in for a long time. Yes. He raised his eyes. Then if I say that I am your husband, you will recognize me as your husband? She was stunned for a moment. No way. He looked at her condescendingly. Then why did you let me do it when I said I wanted to be your brother? And why didn't you let me do it when I wanted to be a husband? She said blankly, I'm not stupid. Can my brother and my husband be the same? What's the difference? Her mind was suddenly spinning fast. Then the assumption is the same. Why do you have to worry about whether it's the elder brother or the husband? Brother Lian-san. Well, you're not stupid. He smiled angrily. He didn't answer her question directly, but she didn't really want him to. She thought about it. So I think, Brother Lian-san, you refused to marry me at that time because you were destined to be my brother. The fate between us is that of brother and sister. This has been predestined by God. Yes. After saying this, she thought about it again and realized that there was nothing wrong. When she raised her head to look at Lian-san, she only encountered his cold eyes. After just one glance at her, he turned his head away as if he had had enough, and sneered, It's destiny. How can you even know what destiny is? Her heart thumped, feeling that he was furious. She moved to the edge of the bed little by little, moved closer to him, and tentatively stretched out her hand to grab his arm. He lowered his eyes and fell on her mischievous hand, but did not move her away. She became more confident, encouraged herself, moved closer to him, and tentatively put her cheek against him. She lightly rubbed his arm, raised her head and raised her eyes to look at him, and said in a soft voice, Brother Lian-san, don't be angry, I was wrong. In fact, she didn't know where she was wrong, but she knew that as long as she admitted her mistake, he would definitely calm down. If she made a mistake when serving the Queen Mother, as long as she behaved like this, her old man would definitely forgive her. She felt Lian-san's arm stiffen for a moment, and she couldn't figure out the reason for it, but he didn't say anything, nor did his body give any signal to forgive her. She couldn't help but rub his arm again and down the arm, moving her cheek towards his palm. Without her needing to make any additional movements, his palm had been spread out, so her left cheek easily touched the warm palm. She rubbed it again and asked him softly with her face turned sideways, Brother Lian-san, don't we want to be friends and kiss each other? He still didn't respond to her, but his eyes never left her, and his eyes were dark. In fact, it had been a long time since she had acted coquettishly with someone like this, but this trick was always tried and tested. She was very confident and was not really worried that Lian-san would not be able to coax him back. She closed her eyes under Lian-san's gaze and pursed her mouth slightly. I know that Brother Lian-san is not really angry with me, but we still. Before she could finish her words, she felt a kiss against her cheek. The palm moved. She opened her eyes immediately. His fingers had grasped her chin, and he used skillful force to force her upper body to straighten, and her face was close to his. Where did you go wrong? He asked her, his voice as low as a whisper. And at such a close distance, she couldn't help but focus all her attention on his face. She was confused and thought, what went wrong? How do I know what I did wrong? Since you don't feel that you are at fault, why should you apologize? He continued to ask her, but his voice was not as cold as before. She thought to herself that my coquettishness had an effect, so she still had to apologize and act coquettishly. Then she felt his hand leave her chin, but moved along the arc of her chin to her earlobe. He seemed to be appreciating a handicraft, his fingers tracing across her skin like the rounded surface of agarwood, with comments and appreciation. It was difficult for her to tell whether the fingertips touching her contained any emotions. She just felt that her earlobes were itchy, but her body seemed to be frozen, and she could not raise her hand to touch for confirmation. Under his deep eyes, she felt a sense of absurdity and couldn't help but murmur, Brother Lian-san. He smiled and moved closer to her. Their cheeks were almost touching. He whispered in her ear, I don't think I'm wrong. I just want to get through acting like a baby, right? She vaguely felt that they were close to each other. Being too close, the fragrance of Baichinon on his body made her a little dizzy. When he turned to face her, all she could see was his eyes. His eyes are beautiful. She had countless metaphors that could be used to describe his phoenix eyes or his gaze at this moment. The gaze was restrained, but also beguiling, as if the soft resin deliberately contained a butterfly, waiting for her to accidentally fall into it, and it would freeze her forever. Those ambers were shaped like that. She felt a bit of overwhelming pressure, so she closed her eyes, but she did not forget to answer his question. I was indeed right. It was all destined. She thought for a moment, and then whispered, "Don't let go today. If the imperial grandmother grants you another marriage, will you, Brother Lensan, change your mind about marrying me?" She felt him hold his breath as the words left her mouth. This was so strange. He was so scared that he had to hold his breath every time. Was he also frightened by the hypothesis she put forward? She instantly forgot the pressure he had brought to her and wanted to laugh. She secretly opened one eye and then the other. Then she saw his expression. He was a little stunned. "You don't want to marry me." She smiled, a little proudly. "You will also find it strange, because when you met me, I became your sister." Liansan's stunned eyes finally focused and fell back on her face. He let go of her little by little. He looked at her for a long moment, but expressed neither approval nor disapproval of her conclusion. The lantern exploded again, and he was quiet for a moment, then turned around and took out the pair of silver scissors again. He cut the lamp flowers, but did not return to her bedside. He just stood by the crane-shaped lamp and pondered for a while, and then said, "Then, let's go back to the original question I asked you." He was no longer angry, and Chengyu was very happy and confirmed to him, "So, Brother Lian-san, you've calmed down, right?" He rolled his eyes at her. "I wasn't angry to begin with." Chengyu rubbed the hem of her skirt and said dryly, "Okay, you're not angry. After thinking about it, so the original question is." Then her expression slowly changed. She remembered the original question. He asked her what Jew hibiscus sealed. After a long time, she whispered, "I don't want to say it." But her right hand nervously held the skirt of her chest, and her eyes once again gathered water. It seemed that something was causing her great pain, and all her vitality and beauty were sucked away by something in an instant. She knew that once the seal was removed, those terrible memories made her feel guilty all the time. Her face turned pale again, and she looked at the young man in front of her and begged in a low voice, "Don't force me, Brother Lensan." End of chapter 10, book 1. 3 lives, 3 worlds. Lotus steps. Wherever step goes, Lotus blooms. Metamorphosis original work by Tangqi Gongzi. English translated using Google.